Hi, and welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. The New York Times has compared The Many Lives of Mama Love to Wild, Orange is the New Black, and Catch Me If You Can, with heartfelt, humor-tinged prose. That book page still cautions readers within a memoir of lying, stealing, and healing will grip you as suddenly as any psychological thriller, where readers will experience the lows and highs of addiction, incarceration, and rehabilitation, as the author assembles the pieces of her shattered life into something beautiful again in this inspiring chronicle. So moving that Oprah Winfrey selected it as her 104th official book club pick for 2024. She celebrated the way in which Hardin's life story is exceptional, and her writing is infinitely relatable, laced through with wisdom on redemption, reinvention, and resilience that will resonate with anyone who's faced the messiness of life head on and come out on the other side. While Oprah personally promised that once you start reading, be prepared, because you won't want to stop, as Lara chronicles how she went from surviving behind bars to becoming a best-selling ghostwriter and author, sharing her harrowing, sometimes hilarious, and often heartbreaking journey from the arrest to conviction to a release and ultimate reinvention. Known for her other New York Times bestseller, co-written with wrongfully convicted and exonerated 30 years later former inmate Anthony Ray Hinton on his memoir, The Sun Does Shine, How I Found Life and Freedom on Death Row, which Archbishop Desmond Tutu, another co-writer of Hardin's, declared to be an amazing and heartwarming story, which restores our faith in the inherent goodness of humanity. Along with other impressive collaborations she counts in her catalog, including with late South African President Nelson Mandela. And she's here today to talk about her extraordinary story. Lara, welcome to the show. Now, when do you first remember storytelling capturing your imagination as a child?
I remember reading at a really young age. And then, I read Gone with the Wind in first grade. I was a reader, and really books were my escape. I mean, the first line of my book is reading was my first addiction, right? And in a healthy way, but it was really this escape into different worlds. And I didn't have the best childhood. And so reading was my comfort and my solace and my window to other people's lives and how they were living. And I always loved to read. I mean, and then through high school junior high, high school, into college, that was my thing. In really young childhood, I remember reading a lot of Judy Blume and Beverly Cleary. And it was you're making sense of the world a little bit. As a teenager, it was a lot of Nora Roberts and romance books, kind of escaping into that. And then, I'm trying to think what high school was school, whatever that was. College and graduate school in writing was a lot of the classics, for my MFA program, we had to read 25 classics. And so Dostoevsky, I got really into it. That was a surprise, and really it was anything that I was curious about, I could find a book on. And I love that. I still do that.
Traveling back to that MFA or even before, when you look back on undergraduate or high school, who stand out as any favorite academic cheerleaders?
Mr. Miller, Sanborn Middle School, Concord, Massachusetts, 7th grade social studies teacher, was really the first one that I remember really encouraging me. And, it was social studies. It wasn't an English class, but learning about the Vietnam War, and then I'd write a short story, or I studied apartheid then, and Desmond Tutu, who later I would work with, so he really made an impression on me and really saw something and encouraged me. And high school, writing was what I was good at. And I think if you read a lot, it's the gateway drug to that, right? I think it's the foundation for a lot of writers. And I loved writing. It's how I made sense of the world, made sense of things I was learning at school, writing short stories. And I was good at it, and I got praise for it. So I did more of it. Right. And sometimes you go to college, you're like, what am I going to do? And I was like, well, I'm good at that. Let me do that.
Before hitting shelves with your own memoir, you began your career as a ghostwriter, leading you to incredible collaborations, preceding debuting in your own name as an author, writing books ranging from The Book of Forgiving by Desmond Tutu, Notes to the Future by Nelson Mandela, Enjoy the Sandwich by Lee Lipsenthal, MD, Only Say Good Things by Crystal Hefner, and Designing Your Life by Bill Burnett and Dave Evans. When you look back over that invaluable experience, helping others shape their own stories on the page, how do you feel it most helped prepare you to eventually tell your own when the time came?
So I was a collaborative writer, ghostwriter. And I, again, went to graduate school for for creative writing, not knowing what I was going to do in that and not thinking I could make any money in that. But being an 80s child, you know, Bret Easton Ellis, like that was the thing. Like, oh, he's in his early 20s and he's, you know, famous and rich from writing. So there's a little bit of that when for all of us who are in our graduate writing program. But I had kids, I stopped writing, did lots of other things. And so about 13 years ago, I answered a part-time ad for a literary agency. So I was rebuilding my life. I was going to be an assistant. So I went to work there and immediately was working on a book with Desmond Tutu, like right away. It was a crazy journey. I think I was really excited to be writing again after having stopped for a good decade between, and obviously there's more to the story that got me to that literary agency. But I started collaborative writing with the authors that we represented and the agency with Doug Abrams, and quickly went, you know, I started as a part-time 5-hour-a-week assistant with an MFA in creative writing, which wasn't really what the job was for. And then when I left 12 years later, I was the co-CEO. And in that time, I collaborated on 12 books there, where I was supporting the authors who, you know, and I think a lot of people don't know that for nonfiction, you know, the chances that you're going to be this amazing world leader and also be a trained narrative storyteller are pretty slim. So a lot of people have writing help in that world. And so I was working with, I started working with neuroscientists and Stanford professors and Desmond Tutu, and then working on books, not as a writer, but as editing and just support for Brian Stevenson and the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu for the Book of Joy, and just all of these wonderful, good people in the world. So that's really how I started. I never was like, I'm a ghostwriter, I'm going to hang out my shingle. It was just sort of part of my job.
That would lead you serendipitously to helping co-author former death row inmate Anthony Hinton, wrongfully convicted and eventually exonerated after spending 30 years in prison. Tell his story of perseverance before finally gaining his freedom, as captured in the instant New York Times bestseller. How did you and Anthony first come to work together on The Sun Does Shine, How I Found Life and Freedom on Death Row?
The agency I worked at, we represented Brian Stevenson for the book Just Mercy, who is leads the Equal Justice Initiative and is an attorney defending people on death row out of Montgomery, Alabama. And he had, in 2015, after 30 years as an innocent man, gotten Anthony Ray Hinton out. And so he called and asked if he really thought Anthony Ray Hinton had a story to tell, and would we come to Alabama and meet with him? And I remember watching this video of Anthony Ray Hinton getting out of jail after 30 years. You know, he's 29, innocent man. And he walked up to the microphone, and there's lots of cameras and relatives crying. And the first words he said were, "The sun does shine." And I remember I created a little Word doc. I hadn't met him yet. I didn't know I was going to work on the book, but I was like, that's the title of his book. And that I named the little Word doc that. And so we went to Montgomery, Alabama, and visited EJI, and I met Mr. Hinton, and we had barbecue, and we hit it off, and he decided to trust me with helping him tell his story. And, you know, I was the last person he probably imagined, right? When I grew up in Massachusetts, I'm a middle-aged white woman from California. He was a man who was put on death row simply because he was poor and Black. And on the surface, it would seem like we don't have enough in common that we could collaborate together to tell his story in a way that was authentic and true to him. And we found out we had more in common than we thought, and really became very close. I mean, that kind of writing, collaborative writing, you get so close to the people whose voice you are being, right, on the page. And it is I've trained a dozen collaborative writers, and a lot of them are former fiction writers, because they have, if you're writing fiction, you're looking at the world through different characters, you're embodying different characters on the page. And so that I find that translates really well to that kind of nonfiction writing. And voice is just something you can't teach. Like you can teach a lot of things, but voice, I think, is something, you get from reading, people can do or can't do. And so the best collaborative writer, if you're writing as that person, they think they've said every word that you've written down because it is so true to them, both internally and it sounds like them perfectly. And that's fun. That's a fun thing to do. My first trip to Birmingham, Alabama, I spent a week there with him. And obviously Brian Stevenson was his attorney. So they had, I spent 14 hours in the EJA offices with a copy machine and my phone, both taking pictures and copying just so many files and caseloads. I had 7,000 pages of court transcripts, right? This is 30 years of court appearances. And you can't guess at the dialogue at a court appearance, but you have a transcribe, right? So all the dialogue in court is word for word from those transcripts. And, as I'm sure now I feel like a slacker, 100 books. That's crazy. Now I have a new goal. But I feel like, real life, you can't make it up any better than like in fiction, right? When I was reading Anthony Ray Hinton's transcripts, when he was sentenced to death, he said, I can't remember the exact words, but I have the book, but it was like, you can't take my soul. Like the truth's going to come out. Like he had this framing for a story arc before we knew he didn't know it'd be 30 years. But when I read that, I was like, oh, this is wonderful. This is, going straight on the page as it has to. But so I read those court transcripts many, many times. I got copies of all of the case files and notes from EJI and Brian Stevenson. I remember Brian Stevenson handed me this big book and it was, post-appellate court law in Alabama. And he was like, good luck, just gave me this big, giant book of legalese. So there was that piece of it, the court piece of it, which we wanted to get right. And the case. And then it was just spending a lot of time with Mr. Hinton. And we spent weeks and weeks together in person. Because as you know, there's the stories they tell, but then there's also just out to eat and in the way they think of things and the way they compare things. You never know what little nuggets and threads you're going to pick up at any moment. And there's sort of no replacement for spending time together like that. And yeah, we ate a lot of food together. And I interviewed him. I recorded it. We videotaped a lot, and it was hard. There are sometimes when we just have to stop, especially if you're doing something that's really traumatic, and then the challenge with that book is he spent 30 years in a 5x7 room where every day is the same, right? So how do you encapsulate the pivotal scenes in that and make it interesting and a page turner? Like that's a challenge. And he is a natural born storyteller, and just really an amazing human. Like I've worked with some great spiritual leaders, and he probably is my greatest spiritual teacher. I think the things I learned from him. And then I'd read him chapters. I'd go draft from all of the transcripts of our conversations, and then I'd call him and read him a chapter, and he would tell me what I'd gotten wrong. Like, he's Auburn, not University of Alabama, that, things like that. And it was a really wonderful, wonderful experience. And one of the hardest books I've ever collaborated on. There's one night I was in my office and I was working on the manuscript, and unlike if you're doing, like I did Designing Your Life book, Stanford book, design thinking, but really, truly like being him on the page, there was a moment, and this is the first time it's ever happened collaborating, where it was like too much for me. Like I was sobbing because I was feeling like what he was feeling, that devastation. And I'm a mom of 4 boys, like I would think about that with my own boys. Like, what would you do? He also had a box of, this is a very long answer to your question, but he also had a box of, he'd gotten from his mom's house. His mom died while he was on death row, and it was devastating for him. He was very close to her. And he gave me this box that he hadn't opened. And so from her stuff, and I opened it and, was gathering research, and I found all of these cards and letters she had written to his original defense attorney. And I didn't know that he hadn't seen these. And we had a video camera going, and we were like in a hotel living room recording. And I was like, and I couldn't read his mom's handwriting on one of the cards. And I was like, hey, can you read this? I can't tell exactly what this says. And he had never seen those before. And she had been writing his defense attorney and sending like $50 here and there that she didn't have. It was a lot of money, and he shouldn't have been taking, like pleading for him to save our son's life. And he hadn't known that. And we're all these years later. And so he broke down, and I was like, stop, turn off the recorders, turn off the cameras, because it was intense for him. But he's become a very close friend, close to my family. My son Cody was doing a lot of the videotaping. He was in film school, so he was videoing. So he spent a lot of time in Alabama with us also.
After seeing so many New York Times bestsellers with others authors on their covers, even though you played an important creative role in helping to get them there, how did it feel to bask in the success of The Sun Does Shine, this time sharing a co-author credit?
It's interesting because, as doing that kind of writing, your acknowledgments, your title page. So I've got, with the Gottmans, I'm on the title page for some of those books. And that was huge, little tiny print, but, you're proud of that. And I was really excited to be in the acknowledgments pages of books. I like to be a good adjacent, I called it, and for him, he wanted me on the cover with him, and it made sense. It made sense for a lot of reasons, and you don't want to think that you're putting more into it when you're getting cover credit, but I think you might a little bit, but this was just a really, it felt really great to be on the cover in general, and with him especially, given what he went through. And, his book was an Oprah Book Club pick. So that was like incredibly exciting to be, again, Oprah adjacent with that cover credit, and his story getting that spotlight and getting to meet her through his story was amazing. That's the dream.
When the time came for you to write your own memoir, boy did you have a brave, harrowing, and ultimately triumphant time getting there. It's captured eloquently within coverage of the book on Oprah Daily, where they profiled a backstory like no other, wherein no one expected the police to knock on the $1 million two-story home of the perfect cul-de-sac housewife. But soccer mom Lara Hardin has been hiding a shady secret. She's funding her heroin addiction by stealing her neighbor's credit cards. Laura's convicted of 32 felonies and becomes inmate S32179. She learns that jail is a class system with a power structure that's somewhere between an adolescent sleepover party and Lord of the Flies. Furniture's made from tampon boxes and Snicker bars a currency. But Laura quickly finds the rules and brings love and healing to her fellow inmates as she climbs the social ladder to become a, quote, shot caller, showing that jailhouse politics aren't that different from a PTA meeting she used to attend. Laura must learn how to forgive herself and others, navigate life as a felon on probation, prove to herself that she's more good than bad, and much more. A heartbreaking and tender journey from shame to redemption, despite a system that makes it almost impossible for us to move beyond the worst thing we've ever done. Prior to that made-for-a-memoir or TV movie for that matter turn in your story, please share anything you're comfortable with about your life prior to receiving that fateful knock on the door from law enforcement.
The story is I became addicted to opiates, like before the opiate crisis was a crisis, and they were handed out like sample packs everywhere in the mid-90s. To prescription opiates, and that was kind of on and off, and then that led to a heroin addiction. And within the course of starting to smoke heroin to being arrested in my home was about 11 months, and I'd lost everything. Like everything had fallen apart, and I had 4 boys of my own. Teenagers to almost 4, and 2 stepchildren, and my whole life was falling apart. I was frantically, didn't know how to stop, didn't know how to ask for help, and knew everything was spiraling out of control. And Started committing crimes, nothing violent, like stealing my friends' credit cards and using them at the grocery store and the gas station and such. Each time is a felony. And so I was arrested and spent a year incarcerated in Santa Cruz County Jail. I know those pill mills in Florida because they were FedExing to every cul-de-sac housewife, you know? So, the knock on the door, I remember every second of it because, you know, my 3 older boys and my stepchildren were all at school, but my youngest son was home. And I remember this, it's almost like you split in two and you're watching it like a movie, you know, because suddenly there's a part of me that was like relieved that it was over. There's a little, you know, until, you know, I'm in handcuffs and Child Protective Services is taking my son and he's crying and I can't hold him and comfort him. All I can say is these people are friends. And and my neighbors are standing out. You know, I lived in places people didn't, you know, they didn't get swarmed by police cars. And I really felt like I split in two. And it was mostly around my son being taken like that. I was begging to call someone and I could have someone here in 5 minutes. And it was that moment where the collateral damage of my internal struggles and mental health struggles became like too much that it was really like I had to sort of disassociate a little bit in that moment. And, you know, it's hard because I think like I have had for a long time real PTSD around that. But in my mind, I'm like, I caused that. So that like, I can't have trauma around something I caused or heal it, you know, like that was like a real thing I had to like dig into and uncover. But I remember going, you know, being in the back of a police car and going to jail, and I'd never been in jail before. And I was walking into the sheriff's deputy was taking me into the jailhouse, and I was crying the whole time, like, where are they taking my son? Can you tell me where my son is? Because I was, you know, worried about him. And he said, you know, you'll never see your son again. And you should not be anyone's mother. And that was like this moment of shame. And I believed him. And it took me 11 years to get over that until I got on that stage. Like really, that is the arc and a few nights later, I was in jail, and this is like not a spoiler for the book if anyone hasn't read it, because obviously I wrote the book and I survived, but I really believe in redemption. I love a good redemption arc. I just didn't believe I deserved one and that it was in the cards for me and that I had just completely failed at life. Like I tried, I failed. I have nothing in me at this moment to get through what's ahead of me. And I don't know what's ahead of me. I might never see any of my children again. You know, and so I decided to end my life. Luckily, I failed and I was not in that dark place again, but it was really a long journey to rebuild and sort of, you know, I thought and I started writing again in jail. I started ghostwriting for the women in jail. That's really my ghostwriting start, you know, writing letters as them to get them passes or to treatment instead of prison and things like that. And I was good at that. Right. And so, but it was really a long journey I thought like, okay, after sentencing and this whole long ordeal, you know, I've done my time and I've followed, you know, I did it perfectly. Like I'm a rule follower, even though I had a lot of felonies, and I'm following all the rules and I never got in trouble and I'm helping people and I'm following all the rules of probation and I'll be done. And I didn't realize like how you're never done. Like I'm still not done. 15 years later, there's still things that I can't go to Canada. I can't serve on a board. I can't, you know, all of these things. And there's still that judgment was really the hardest thing to get over, both in the community and at large, because any any credibility you have is now gone because I'm a convicted felon. You shouldn't believe a word I'm saying, right? Like there's that sort of belief system that I'm hoping, when I did my book, it was also like sort of destigmatizing. It was terrifying at first because I didn't understand where I was. And, I was in the county jail, which in California, in our county and in California, I think the jails are built for short-term stays, ideally, right? Like they don't program and they don't have the same kind of visiting. They don't, it's supposed to be a short-term stay, but because of the overcrowding in the prisons, I think it was people could stay up to 3 years in county jail, which is really, really hard to do. And so I was sentenced to a year. So I was going to be a year there. And it was, the women I were with, they were my guide because I'd never been there before. I was also older, like my closest friend in jail at the beginning was 19 years old. My oldest son was 17, so I have a lot of mother energy. I was the mom of 4 and I had nowhere to put that. So there was a lot of mother energy. There was a culture, and there's a little bit of respect if you're older. And that sort of nothing is for free thing. I had to learn that, and I'm kind of I like to help. Like that's kind of like a little bit in my nature, like for whatever reason, but you can't help for free. Right. So, because that's suspect in jail. So like everybody does have their skills. Some people are great, beautiful artists, and there's like really talented, amazing, creative, wonderful, traumatized women in jail. 80% of women in jail are mothers, often the sole caregivers. So we had a lot that in common. And again, I was not on drugs, and I started writing again. Like those two things, unlike Hemingway and Bukowski and all that, those things can't coexist for me, right? So I started writing again. Like I wrote a narrative poem. I'm not a poet, about the women in G Block, and read it to them. And I think there was something like I had that skill, but also the women loved being written about too. Like everybody is so devalued, and you're in this system where, again, probably 90+%, 95% have some history of domestic violence or sexual violence or childhood abuse, and you're in a system that's run by men and controlled by men, and everything that you're doing is controlled. So there's a lot of traumatized women together being re-traumatized and triggered every day in a system built for men. So that's my soapbox on that. But so I started, and I'm a mom, and I've been in the PTA, and I coach Little League. So like disagreements and crowds, like I had a transferable skill set from the soccer mom life to there. And I think also it's really important to know that like I didn't go to jail and save a bunch of women. Like those women saved me. Like they were all gone through the court system with their own children at CPS. So like they educated me on that and what to do and what the courts were. Cause I was just like, there's not a lot of information, and there's no, it's not like you get locked up and there's a welcome brochure or an orientation, you're kind of just thrown in there to figure it out. And it became clear very quickly that I had never been there before. Like I didn't know the rules, and some things were just illogical to me, and I wasn't in a place where I was in so much shame and guilt and despair in my outside life that I couldn't advocate for myself, but in there I could advocate for other people. And again, I started writing, I broke up with a lot of people for women. I was like, oh, I seduced a few guys for what, in letters, like writing was my skill set, and you get paid in bear claws and ramen and pens and paper to write with. And so that's just kind of how the trade works. And I think I had a lot of not, it's like weird to call it elder wisdom because I wasn't that old, but my experiences and my sort of understanding of psychology and all of that. At first I was just trying to like get everyone to calm down and be quiet and like chill. And then that sort of turned into, that sort of PTA mom to shot caller kind of journey. And it's funny because when I've had some women recently that I was in jail with read the book, And before, when the book came out, and they sent me pictures or texted that they were reading the book. And I thought, oh, is one of them going to say like, wait, you thought you were shot caller? Because we're all in our perspective, but no one said that. But it was really interesting to just kind of vet my experience from my perspective versus the other women I was there with that I've managed to stay in touch with that are doing okay. Because it's very few that are doing okay, but there are some who are killing it in the world.
Once you were released from incarceration and successfully beginning to rebuild your life, how tempting was it to naturally start sharing anything about your own past struggles, as you were writing with so many remarkable figures who were doing just that about their own trials and tribulations on the page?
I did keep it a secret working on all these books. And I lived in fear of people Googling me. I'm working on the Book of Forgiving with Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who literally is writing the Book of Forgiving. And I am so afraid that he will find out my secret that I'm a formerly incarcerated woman.
Now, what do you pinpoint, looking back now, was the moment when you finally felt ready to start sharing your own story with the world? Whether out loud at first, maybe with one of your co-writers, as a precursor to your doing so on paper firsthand. And how fearless and inspired did you feel once you began putting it all down?
I would say the baby steps to do my own book was working on the book with Anthony Ray Hinton, because telling Brian Stevenson about my past actually was one of the reasons that Mr. Hinton trusted me with his story. It became when the agency was selling the book to editors, from the book proposal. I remember Doug Abrams, who was my business partner and was Mr. Hinton's agent. He was doing all the editor calls with them. And he said, do you know how hard it is to find a collaborative writer who's been incarcerated? Now, I've worked with these editors for years. They didn't know this. And they're like, oh my God, that's fantastic. Like, it became a selling point. And I was like, oh, it was just a complete, I was in so much shame that it was like this huge shift. I was like, oh, this is a different reality. But it was all, but I seriously lived in fear. And I was like working on all these books with all these great books impacting millions of people and New York Times bestsellers. And again, hiding in the acknowledgements and trying to do good in the world. And it was like this race. Like, I knew the truth would come out. So I'm trying to be as good as possible before those two things collide. Like, I was proving myself, right? I was proving that I was valuable and worthy. Because when you've been incarcerated, and unlike Anthony Ray Hinton, I was guilty, it was the judgment comes and the credibility leaves, and it doesn't matter how talented you are, what you've done, those things collide. And so part of me knew there was a collision happening. So that was one thing. And then also the weight of carrying secrets and shame was just so heavy in so many ways and so isolating. And so I did a TEDx talk locally at the end of 2019. And I got up on a stage and I said, here's the worst version of myself I've ever been. Here's the worst thing I've done. And here's some other people I've been. And I kind of outed myself. And the feeling of light, like the feeling I had after that, was better than any drug I was ever addicted to, honestly. And I found that I had a lot to say about that. And I was surprised. And so I started working on the book proposal after that. It was hard for a lot of different reasons. One, I had never told these stories to anyone. I had just been working hard, like to rebuild my life. And I had no one, I never allowed them, but no one ever said, what was it like going to jail? Being free was wonderful in that you're free and you can eat and you can see the ocean if you want to. And it was absolutely terrifying because of all of the reasons in any moment you can go back to jail that have nothing to do with committing a crime. Like I have not taken a drug in 15 years. I still have dreams that I'm going to be accidentally put back in jail, right? The way I describe probation, because it's just, again, it's illogical and it's bureaucratic, and you have to be in 3 different places at once, and you don't have transportation or childcare. Like, yeah, everything is set up to send you back. And there are times, and that's without even just dealing with the community and the public, depending on where you live. Like, even in a liberal progressive town, there is a little bit of like, yeah, we're progressive, but not next door, right? So all of the things like to rebuild a life, and I was fighting a clock to get my son back out of CPS, which I did, and reunite and rebuild. And there were times when I thought I would be safer in jail. But the way I describe it is like walking a tightrope in high heels in a windstorm. That's what every day felt like, right? Just getting through. And sometimes I look back and I'm like, I don't know how I did it. I know why I did it. I don't know exactly how. And and there's ways in which, you know, I write this in the book, like every sentence, no matter what it is a life sentence, right? Like every sentence, because again, I'm obsessed with the fact that I can't go to Canada right now, even though I have no plans to go to Canada. I'm like, where's the logic in the why? Because I have a record, I can't go to Canada. But yeah, so but it is this thing, like even with the book, like I had restitution, I did a plea deal. So I pled guilty to far more than I did. I paid back thousands more than I think I actually stole $900. I paid back 19,000, to be honest. And so, and I haven't said that publicly because again, you get like, you have to just be like, not advocating and not, you know, at the time I wasn't like you can't parse it out, right? I was just desperate to have my children back in my life. But I think there's things like, even with the book coming out, like you should never make a penny again. And I was like, well, should I not be able to have a home for my children? Or my youngest son just started college. Should I not be able to help pay for that? Like, I don't understand this sort of idea, especially with something that's not violent and wrapped around what I think are health issues and mental health issues, certainly for most women who are incarcerated, like this idea that you should always pay forever, and your children and generation, that's how generations pay for this. And so anyway, I could go on and on about that. When I went to do my book, I was really one, it's a crazy story. As a literary agent, I'm like, okay, this is a crazy story on a, you know, like that journey from ghostwriting in jail to being convicted of identity theft and then getting paid to assume people's identities in all these books you see behind me, right? Like there's a weird, irony there. But it was really like I wasted so much time and shame and so many things I was not present to, experiences, because I was keeping people at a distance, afraid that they would reject me if they knew, or shun me, or, you know, whatever it was. So so when I sat down to do my book, it was really hard, first of all, to figure out what my own voice was after being so many other voices. I mean, I had some false starts, I will admit, but and 12 of the books I had collaborated on were by men, right? I'd only done one book as a woman on the page too. So it was, what is my voice? And what is the real voice versus like, because when you can write and you can do voices, like you could I could have been anybody on the page, right? And so I had some false starts. So I sent a couple chapters to my editor and he was like, and I was like, okay, I'm not actually being real here. So I actually, to do my book, the first draft, I went away for 2 months or 7 weeks to Thailand. I had to go to a different time zone, away from my family, away from work, where I could just get really honest. And there's things I put in the book that were not in the book proposal that sold to Simon Schuster. There were things that I had never told anyone about. And I made a decision, if I'm actually going to do this, I'm going to be really honest. Unbearably honest, and I had to not think about the fact that my kids were going to read this, which I let them read before it went into production. But so it was hard at first, but the minute I decided to be really honest, it was a lot easier to get my voice. And I wrote I had this, the book wasn't, have a year, when a book sells from, people don't know, a nonfiction book proposal, my book sold to Simon Schuster. I had a year to do the manuscript. And I'm a notorious procrastinator. Like all of the books I collaborated on, there's a year contract, and it's like the last 2 months, I'm like, oh, I better get going on this. So I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to rush it. I want to give myself like some time and space. And so I used some of that book advance, and I went to Thailand, which I'd never been to. I just always wanted to go. And so, but I have this thing where I don't, because I've written so many books, like I know it takes as much time as you have, right? It takes as much time as you have. A book can take a year, it can take 2 months, like whatever you think it takes. For me, it takes that much time. So I have this thing where I'm not on a first draft of a chapter, I'm never going to spend more than 2 days. And often, so I was in Thailand. I love warm water. I love the sun. I'd never been to Thailand, but I told myself every day, I can't go anywhere in the afternoon and see this island unless I finish a chapter. So I have to create little deadlines for myself. And I'm going to write a whole first draft in 7 weeks because I know I can. I finished like the last chapters, like in Doha, like on my connecting flight in the airport, but I did it. And they were short chapters, just to be fair, so people don't think it's anything crazy. But I did the draft in 7 weeks, and it was dark at times, and I thought I was controlling the weather because like a monsoon came in like the darkest chapters, and it was intense in the way I had to do it.
Congratulations for being selected by Oprah Winfrey as her 104th official book club pick. We've gotten some entertaining reactions from other authors who found themselves in the same position. What was that moment when you found out like for you? We understand she popped into a video call between you and your publisher, Simon & Schuster, to break the news personally?
It's funny because it is such the dream of every author because the spotlight is there. There's nothing comparable really. And so when my book, first published, came out August 1st, right? And I think more recently she's doing things, people are picking their book clubs on pub date, right? So, it was about for 6 months, I was answering every like unknown caller, and it was all like home warranty, like your auto, like it was just, I answered every spam call thinking, could this be it? And then, when it happened 7 months after pub day, she popped into a Zoom, but I was like, well, she's actually in my book. So probably she couldn't pick it because it would seem, that she was picking it for that reason. So yeah, it was very crazy and a wonderful surprise. But I think doing the book and having it out there, 3 weeks before it came out, I had this sort of panic attack, like, what have I done? Like I kept the secret for so long. I did it. And then it was like, I felt so naked. And like, when you overshare with people and you're like, oh, why did I just tell you this thing? I had that feeling and this sort of panic. And then it came out. I got over that, did book tour, but really like the response, even, pre Oprah, getting it even more out there in the world, like really amazing how much I think people messages I've gotten, especially from women who have no experience with addiction or incarceration, but they can relate to having something you're ashamed of, or that people will find out, that that sense of not belonging anywhere, of being uncomfortable in your own skin. And what surprised me, a lot of readers whose parents did not make it to the other side of addiction or incarcerated, and they found like some forgiveness and some hope. And, ultimately I learned, like, really, I judge myself the harshest of anyone, and my shame that I felt that I had to, slowly get rid of. It's so slow to get rid of that unless you have a community of people. So I think, the response has been more than I can imagine from readers.
Now, as we discussed earlier, you worked your way up from an assistant at Idea Architects Literary Agency to become a partner before launching more recently your own agency with True Literary. What smart advice have you given authors over the years that you might share here that helped them along as they were putting their first published stories down on the page?
Idea Architects was the agency I first got hired at and built with Doug Abrams. And, to architect ideas, or just, we do a lot of, in my own agency and the agency at Idea Architects, we develop the books, right? So we're all contributing ideas, and it's really based on this foundation that, like, every great book, all genius is a collaborative effort, right? So it is, that's how that started. And then True Literary, when I decided to go off on my own, it was really, there's sort of an Oprah moment in that, when I first met her and she's talking about she was giving me little power lessons at this lunch we had with Anthony Ray Hinton. And she's like, power is having your name on something. Power is like being able to shine your light where you want to shine it, because, people had opinions about what books she picks. Right. And I think for me, it was just like, my lane is books. Like I have my thing I can do. And there's people that need my help and people that don't need my help. I can work with anyone. And so for me, it was just kind of like what voices do I want to lift up? What books what stories do I want to tell in what medium? And so there's just fun in doing that and being true to myself and the books I want to bring to the world. I would say there's absolutely no such thing as writer's block. 100%. That if you're doing a nonfiction book, that means you don't have enough information. If you are doing a fiction, like you don't know your story, your characters. For memoir, you haven't looked in the mirror long enough to know. It's a lack of information. It's not a writer's block. I would say writers, you have to write, not talk about it, not read about it, not theorize on it. Just sit down and write and trust that process. And I think as an agent, there's so many people who are like, oh, if you're not famous or you're not a celebrity, or especially in memoir, or you're not this or that, you're never going to get a chance. Like a good story that has universal appeal to people, that is well written, I think will rise no matter what way it gets into the world, and just focus on that.
Lara, it has been inspiring talking today. Thank you so much for taking out time to be on About the Authors TV.
Thank you.